The scrapyard test. The first motor landed in the scrap bin with a metallic crash that echoed across the yard. Daniel Mercer looked up from the maintenance log he was filling out and watched the forklift back away. Rain had started falling 20 minutes earlier, turning the packed dirt between the storage buildings into dark mud. Water dripped from the edge of his hard hat and ran down the back of his neck. The motor wasn't old. That was what bothered him. Most equipment sent to the scrapyard had lived a full life. Bent frames, cracked housings, decades of wear. This one looked different. Expensive, heavy-duty, barely 5 years old. The second motor followed, then the third. By the time the sixth one hit the container, several workers had gathered nearby. Not because the motors were valuable, because everyone knew what day it was. The layoffs had started that morning. A manufacturing plant had supplied industrial drive systems across 3 states for nearly 40 years, but new ownership had arrived 6 months earlier, bringing consultants, efficiency reports, and endless meetings that seemed to end with fewer people on the payroll. Daniel had survived the first rounds, barely. At 43, he knew how companies viewed people like him, too experienced to replace easily, too expensive to keep forever. The plant manager stepped out of the administrative building, accompanied by the company's new CEO, Richard Hale. The man looked uncomfortable in the rain. His polished shoes weren't designed for industrial yards. Workers pretended not to stare. Everyone was curious. Nobody wanted to show it. Hale scanned the scrap container and shook his head. That's nearly $100,000 sitting in there. Someone laughed. Not anymore. A few chuckles followed. Daniel returned to his paperwork. He had learned long ago that executive conversations rarely improved his day. Then he heard his name. Mercer? He looked up. The CEO was pointing toward the scrap bin. You've been here, 20 years? 18. Close enough. Several workers exchanged glances. Nobody understood where the conversation was going. Hale smiled. You're the repair expert, right? Daniel shrugged. I fix what can be fixed. The CEO gestured dramatically toward the ruined motors. Then here's your chance. More workers turned to watch. If you can do something useful with those, they're yours. Laughter spread through the group. Not cruel laughter, the kind people used when they knew a conversation wasn't serious. Hale seemed pleased with himself. Daniel didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained on the motors. 6 different models, 6 different failure histories, all discarded together. Something about that seemed strange. The CEO waited. Well, Daniel closed his clipboard. If they're headed for scrap anyway, I'll take them. The laughter stopped. Hale blinked. You actually want them? Sure. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the CEO gave a short laugh. Fine, take them. The conversation ended there. But Daniel noticed something. Several maintenance workers were staring at him, not because he had embarrassed himself, because they knew he wasn't joking. That evening, the rain was still falling when Daniel pulled into the driveway of a small rental house on the edge of town. His daughter Emma was sitting on the front steps beneath an umbrella, waiting. She did that often. The sight always made him feel guilty. 12 years old and already accustomed to spending too much time alone. You were late. Sorry. Again. Again. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. He smiled back. Some days, that was enough. Inside, the house carried familiar sounds. The refrigerator humming. The old furnace rattling. Rain tapping against the windows. 3 years earlier, there had been another sound. His wife's voice. Sometimes he still caught himself expecting it. The habit never completely disappeared. Dinner was simple. Pasta. Bread. Conversation moved slowly. Emma talked about school. Daniel listened, mostly. Part of his mind remained stuck in the scrapyard. The 6 motors. The unusual failure pattern. The nagging feeling that something didn't add up. Finally, Emma noticed. You're thinking about work. Daniel looked up. How do you know? You get that face. What face? The one where you're not really here. He laughed softly. Fair enough. After dinner, he headed toward the detached garage behind the house. Emma followed. The workshop occupied half the space. Old tool cabinets lined the walls. Shelves overflowed with spare parts. A workbench sat beneath hanging lights, stained yellow by years of use. The first motor rested in the center. Daniel had borrowed a trailer and hauled all 6 home. Most people would have seen junk. Daniel saw questions. He removed his jacket and reached for a wrench. Metal clicked. Bolts loosened. The housing came apart piece by piece. Hours passed. Rain continued outside. Emma sat nearby doing homework while occasionally handing him tools. Neither spoke much. They were comfortable with silence. Around midnight, Daniel froze. A cooling assembly lay exposed beneath the casing. He leaned closer. Something wasn't right. The damage wasn't where it should have been. He opened another motor. Then another. The same pattern appeared again. Different failures, different environments, different years, yet all connected to one small component. Daniel's heartbeat quickened, not from excitement, from curiosity, the most dangerous feeling an engineer could have. By 2 a.m, notebooks covered the workbench. Measurements, temperatures, maintenance records, calculations. Emma had fallen asleep in a chair. Daniel draped a blanket over her shoulders and returned to the motors. The numbers refused to leave him alone. Finally, he reached for a calculator, then checked again, and again. The result remained unchanged. He stared at the page. Outside, rainwater trickled from the roof. Inside, the garage had become completely silent. The flaw wasn't causing catastrophic failures. That was why nobody noticed. Instead, it slowly reduced efficiency over time. Small losses, tiny increases in energy consumption, gradual wear, individually insignificant, collectively enormous. Daniel grabbed another sheet of paper, more calculations, more estimates. When he finally finished, he sat back in his chair. The number written at the bottom looked absurd. He checked it twice, then a third time. The figure still remained. If his assumptions were correct, factories across the country could be wasting billions of dollars every year because of a problem hidden inside systems nobody bothered to inspect closely. Daniel looked at the 6 broken motors spread across the garage. A joke. That was what everyone thought they were. Yet somewhere beneath layers of grease, corrosion, and discarded metal, they were trying to tell a different story. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he hadn't expected. Possibility. Then he noticed something else. A manufacturer identification stamp buried inside one of the assemblies. The same supplier appeared, on every motor. Daniel's expression slowly changed, because suddenly a more troubling question emerged. How had nobody else found this? Or worse, had someone already found it and chosen not to say anything? The invisible industry. The paper mills smelled like wet wood, machine oil, and steam. Daniel stood near the loading dock before sunrise, watching workers arrive through a thin layer of morning fog. Pickup trucks rolled into the parking lot one after another. Men and women stepped out carrying lunchboxes and coffee cups, shoulders hunched against the cold. 2 months had passed since the night he discovered the pattern hidden inside the 6 discarded motors. 2 months of calculations. 2 months of phone calls. 2 months of rejection. The stack of business cards in his truck told the story better than any spreadsheet could. Plant managers who never returned calls. Executives who listened politely before disappearing. Engineers who dismissed him within 5 minutes. Some never even looked at his data. A few did. Those were somehow worse. They would study the reports carefully, nod their heads, admit his numbers looked solid, then quietly explain why they couldn't take the risk. Nobody wanted to be the first. That was the real problem. Not the technology, not the evidence. Fear. Companies preferred expensive certainty over affordable uncertainty, even when the math suggested they were wrong. Daniel understood it. That didn't make it easier. His savings account was shrinking. Contract repair work barely covered rent. Several nights he had considered walking away from the entire idea. Then came the phone call. Frank Delgado, maintenance director, Riverside Paper Company, a struggling mill located 3 hours north. Frank had spent 32 years keeping aging machinery alive. Unlike most executives, he actually read Daniel's report. Every page. Now he was giving him one chance. One. Daniel checked his watch. 6:23. A few moments later, a broad-shouldered man emerged from the building carrying 2 coffees. Frank. Gray beard, heavy jacket, permanent expression of skepticism. The kind of person who trusted equipment more than people. He handed Daniel a cup. "You look nervous." "I am." "Good." Daniel frowned. Frank took a sip. Nervous people usually double-check their work. The 2 men walked toward the main processing building. The sound hit first. A low mechanical thunder vibrating through steel walls. Pumps, conveyors, industrial motors, massive systems working around the clock, the heartbeat of the facility. Inside, heat replaced the morning cold. Steam drifted through overhead beams. Machines moved with relentless rhythm. Daniel couldn't help studying them. Years of maintenance work had trained his eyes to notice details automatically. A leaking seal, An unusual vibration, a bearing running hotter than normal. Little clues hidden in plain sight. Frank noticed. You do that everywhere? What? Look at machines like they're talking. Daniel smiled. Sometimes they are. Frank laughed. For the first time all morning, the tension eased slightly. They stopped beside a motor nearly the size of a small car. The housing showed visible wear. Years of service, years of repairs, years of temporary fixes. Frank placed a hand on the casing. This is your chance. Daniel nodded. The retrofit system he had designed wasn't complicated. That was part of its beauty. A redesigned cooling assembly, improved airflow, several efficiency adjustments. Minor changes individually, powerful together. The installation would take 2 days, the results would take weeks. That was the problem. Daniel needed patience. His bank account preferred immediate miracles. The first week felt endless. He checked his phone constantly. No updates, no messages, no emergency calls, nothing. Emma noticed. One evening she found him staring at an energy report spread across the kitchen table. Still waiting? Yeah. You hate waiting. I really do. She grinned. You should fix that. Daniel laughed despite himself. Children had a way of making complicated problems sound simple. Later that night, he sat alone on the back porch. The neighborhood was quiet. Streetlights reflected off damp pavement. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. For the first time in weeks, doubt returned. Maybe the calculations were wrong. Maybe he missed something. Maybe everyone else had been right. The thoughts arrived easily after midnight. They always did. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. Daniel answered immediately. Hello? For several seconds, all he heard was background noise. Machines, voices, movement. Then Frank spoke. How fast can you get here? Daniel sat upright. What happened? A pause, long enough to make his stomach tighten. Then Frank said something unexpected. Nothing happened. What? That's the point. The drive north felt longer than before. Questions raced through his mind. By the time he arrived, Frank was waiting outside the control room. This time he wasn't carrying coffee. He was carrying reports. A lot of them. Without speaking, he handed one over. Daniel scanned the numbers, then read them again. The energy consumption curve had changed dramatically. Not overnight. Gradually. Exactly as predicted. The retrofit was working. Actually working. Several operators gathered nearby, watching, listening, waiting. Frank folded his arms. You know what makes me angry? Daniel looked up. What? We spent years replacing equipment that didn't need replacing. The older man shook his head. Millions of dollars. Daniel stared at the report. Relief washed through him slowly. Not excitement. Relief, like finally exhaling after holding his breath for months. One of the operators stepped closer. So what now? Daniel didn't have an answer. Frank did. We tell people. The next few months changed everything. Not quickly, not dramatically. Gradually, the way real change often happens. Another factory called, then another, then 3 more. Every installation produced data. Every successful retrofit created evidence. Every report strengthened Daniel's credibility. For the first time, doors opened before he knocked. But success brought unexpected attention. One afternoon, he received an invitation to a corporate headquarters in Chicago. A manufacturer whose equipment appeared throughout his research. The meeting took place on the 42nd floor. Glass walls, perfect furniture, expensive silence. Nothing like the factories he understood. 3 executives sat across from him. Polite, professional, friendly. Too friendly. Daniel recognized the feeling immediately. Something was off. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Questions, numbers, forecasts, growth projections. Then they finally reached the real reason he had been invited. The number attached to it was larger than anything Daniel had ever imagined. Enough money to erase every financial worry. Enough to secure Emma's future. Enough to change everything. One executive smiled. We believe this arrangement benefits everyone. Daniel continued reading. Then he found the clause. Buried deep within the agreement. His retrofit technology would become company property, immediately, permanently. Future development rights included. The project would effectively disappear into their system. The room remained calm, professional, civilized. But Daniel suddenly understood something. The offer wasn't about helping him succeed. It was about making sure he stopped. Outside the glass wall, Chicago's skyline stretched toward the horizon. Inside, the contract waited on the table, and for the first time since this journey began, Daniel realized exactly how valuable those 6 broken motors had become. The things we choose to build. Daniel left the Chicago office carrying the contract in a plain black folder. By the time he reached the street, evening had settled between the skyscrapers. Wind rushed through the narrow corridors of glass and steel, tugging at his jacket. Around him, people hurried toward trains, restaurants, apartments, and lives that had nothing to do with industrial motors. He stopped beneath a traffic light and looked at the number printed on the final page. It was enough money to change everything, enough to pay off every debt, enough to buy a house, enough to secure Emma's education, enough to guarantee that neither of them would ever worry about bills again. For a few moments, he hated himself for hesitating, because part of him wanted to sign, not out of greed, out of exhaustion. Building something from nothing was harder than he had imagined. Every successful installation created new problems, more customers, more travel, more responsibility, more people depending on him. The company wasn't really a company yet. It was still mostly Daniel. Daniel answering phones, Daniel reviewing reports, Daniel driving across states, Daniel solving emergencies at 2 a.m, Daniel trying and often failing to be in 2 places at once. The traffic signal changed, people crossed around him, Daniel folded the contract and continued walking. Deep down, he already knew his answer. The money was tempting, but something felt wrong. The 6 motors had revealed a problem hidden in plain sight. Selling the solution only to bury it again felt like closing a door that was supposed to remain open. 3 weeks later, he officially declined the offer. The consequences arrived almost immediately. Competitors appeared, industry rumors spread, a few projects were mysteriously delayed. Potential clients suddenly became harder to reach. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious, just enough resistance to make growth more difficult. Frank Delgado called one evening. "You expected this?" Daniel sat in his workshop, reviewing equipment drawings. "Some of it." Frank laughed. "Good. Why? Means you're finally thinking like a business owner." Daniel wasn't sure whether that was a compliment. The truth was, he still thought like a maintenance technician. Machines made sense. People were harder. Machines followed rules. People followed incentives. The distinction became increasingly important. Over the next year, Daniel hired his first employees, then 5 more, then 20. Former mechanics, engineers, field technicians, people who understood industrial equipment the way he did. Many came from factories facing layoffs. Others simply wanted work that felt meaningful. The company began occupying an old warehouse near a rail yard. The building wasn't impressive. Leaking roof, concrete floors, drafty offices, but every morning lights came on before sunrise, and every evening they stayed on long after dark. Slowly, something larger than Daniel started taking shape. The breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. Not from a boardroom, not from investors, not from technology conferences. It came from a customer question. A factory manager in Ohio stood beside an aging motor during an inspection. "If you can rebuild part of it," he asked, "why can't you rebuild the whole thing?" The question lingered. Weeks later, another customer asked something similar. Then another. Daniel began noticing a pattern. Factories were replacing enormous amounts of equipment every year, not because the equipment was worthless, because replacing it had become the default solution. The more he studied the numbers, the clearer the opportunity became. The retrofit business had never been the final destination. It was evidence, proof, a doorway leading somewhere bigger. Instead of merely improving existing motors, what if entire systems could be restored, upgraded, and modernized? What if industrial equipment could have a second life? The idea sounded ambitious, almost unreasonable, which was usually a sign that it deserved serious attention. Within 18 months, the company launched its first remanufacturing division. Old equipment arrived from factories across the country. Worn motors, generators, industrial drives, machines destined for scrapyards. The same fate once assigned to those original 6 motors. Teams stripped them down, rebuilt components, integrated modern upgrades, extended operating life by years, sometimes decades. The results surprised even Daniel. Customers saved millions. Waste decreased dramatically. Demand exploded. Suddenly, the company wasn't just solving efficiency problems, it was changing how industries thought about value. Success, however, carried a cost. One Saturday evening, Daniel arrived home after missing another school event. The house was quiet, too quiet. A folded program sat on the kitchen table. Emma's science competition. First place. He had promised to attend. He hadn't. The realization landed harder than any business setback. Hours later, he found Emma reading in her room. She looked up briefly, then returned to her book. The disappointment wasn't loud. That made it worse. "I'm sorry." She turned a page. "Okay." Daniel sat on the edge of a chair. "I really am." Another pause. Finally, she lowered the book. "You always say that." The words weren't angry, just honest, and honesty often hurt more. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Emma sighed. "I know you're trying. Trying, not succeeding. Trying." Daniel nodded slowly. That night, he sat alone in the workshop long after midnight. The same workshop where everything had started. The same workbench. The same tools. The same 6 motors lined against the wall. He realized something uncomfortable. The company existed because he refused to throw away overlooked potential. Yet he had nearly overlooked the people closest to him. The lesson hit harder than any business challenge. Growth meant nothing if it cost everything else. The following months brought changes. More delegation, more trust, more balance. Not perfect balance. Real balance rarely existed, but better, present, intentional, human. 10 years later, sunlight poured through the glass entrance of Mercer Industrial Renewal's new headquarters. Thousands of employees worked across multiple facilities. Factories throughout the country used the company's systems. Analysts valued the business at more than $500 million. Journalists often asked Daniel about success. They usually expected a secret formula, a breakthrough moment, a genius insight. He always disappointed them because the truth was less dramatic. Success had started with curiosity, with paying attention, with refusing to dismiss something simply because everyone else had. During the headquarters opening ceremony, guests moved through the main lobby. Many stopped in front of a large display case. Inside sat 6 damaged electric motors. Rust marks remained visible. Paint was chipped, the scars of their previous lives untouched. Visitors often assumed they represented failure. They were wrong. They represented possibility. Daniel stood nearby, hands in his pockets. Beside him was Emma, now an engineer working within the company. She smiled as people examined the display. "Funny. What is? Most of them still don't understand." Daniel laughed softly. "No, they see broken machines." He looked at the motors, the same machines that had once been thrown away as a joke, the same machines that had quietly changed the course of his life. Then he looked at his daughter. The person who had been there from the beginning, the person who mattered most. "Maybe that's okay," he said. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Daniel smiled. "Because sometimes value stays hidden until somebody decides to look closer." Outside, trucks arrived carrying equipment, waiting for a second life. Inside, employees passed beneath the company motto, etched into steel above the entrance. "Nothing valuable should be discarded too soon." The words weren't really about machines. They never had been. And as sunlight reflected across the glass case holding 6 forgotten motors, Daniel felt something deeper than pride. Not victory, not wealth, not recognition, gratitude. For the joke that became an opportunity, for the struggle that became a purpose, and for the simple decision, years ago, to look at something broken and ask whether its story was truly finished. Chapter 4. What Remains After the Noise. 5 years after the happening, Daniel Mercer found himself standing in a place he hadn't visited in nearly a decade. The old manufacturing plant, or what remained of it. Most of the original buildings had been demolished. The parking lots were cracked and overgrown with weeds. Rust stained the steel framework that still stood near the rail line. Nature had slowly begun reclaiming what industry had abandoned. A cold autumn wind swept across the empty property. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter. He had received an invitation from the city council months earlier. A redevelopment project was finally beginning. Part of the old industrial district would become a technical training center for young tradespeople, electricians, machinists, maintenance technicians, industrial mechanics, the careers that rarely appeared on magazine covers but kept entire economies running. The organizers wanted him to attend the groundbreaking ceremony. Normally, he avoided public appearances, but this invitation felt different, because everything had started here, not the company. Him, his career, his mistakes, his lessons, his life. The gate that once required a security badge now hung open. Daniel walked slowly through the property. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. The maintenance shop where he spent countless nights troubleshooting equipment failures. The warehouse where he drank terrible coffee during overnight shutdowns. The loading dock where workers gathered during lunch breaks. The scrapyard. He stopped. Even now, he could identify the exact location. The container was gone. The equipment was gone. Everything was gone. Only a patch of cracked pavement remained. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. It looked surprisingly ordinary. Funny, he thought. The most important moments rarely announce themselves. At the time, it had felt like just another difficult day. Another executive, another joke. Life-changing moments often arrived disguised as normal ones. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Mercer?" Daniel turned. A young man stood nearby carrying a camera, 20 years old at most, nervous, trying not to appear nervous. "You with the news crew?" The young man shook his head. "No, sir." He hesitated, then continued. "I work for the training center." Daniel nodded. The young man seemed unsure whether to continue. Finally, he took a breath. "My father used to work here." Daniel looked around. A lot of good people did. He lost his job when the plant closed. The young man paused. "But your company hired him later." Understanding slowly crossed Daniel's face. The young man smiled. "He says it saved our family." For a moment, neither spoke. Daniel never knew how to respond to comments like that. Statistics were easy. People weren't. The young man continued. "He told me if I ever met you, I should tell you something." Daniel waited. The young man laughed. "He said you'd probably hate hearing it." "That's usually a bad sign." He said everybody talks about the motors. Daniel smiled. "They usually do." "But he said the motors aren't the real story." The wind rattled loose sheet metal somewhere across the property. Daniel listened, curious. The young man shifted his weight. "My father says the real story is that when everybody else was trying to replace people, you built a company around keeping things." Daniel looked away for a moment, toward the empty factory floor, toward the fading remains of a place that had once employed hundreds. The comment stayed with him, because he wasn't entirely sure whether it was true, but he wanted it to be.
The ceremony itself was small.
Nothing flashy. A temporary stage. Several local officials, former workers, families, students, community leaders. The kind of gathering that rarely attracted national attention, yet somehow felt more meaningful than any corporate event. When Daniel's turn came to speak, he approached the podium without notes. He preferred it that way. Prepared speeches often sounded like someone else talking. The crowd settled. A few hundred people stood beneath gray skies. Many faces were familiar. Older now, but familiar. Daniel looked at them for a long moment, then began. "When people tell the story of my company, they usually start with 6 broken motors." A few people smiled. The story had become well known. Daniel continued. "I understand why." He glanced toward the old scrapyard. "It's a simple story." A pause. "But simple stories leave things out." The crowd listened quietly. "The truth is that those motors weren't valuable because they contained an opportunity." His voice remained calm, measured. The opportunity was already there. He looked at the students gathered near the front. The value came from noticing it. The wind carried dry leaves across the pavement. Daniel continued. "Factories taught me something important. Most failures don't happen all at once." People nodded. Many understood exactly what he meant. Machines, communities, relationships, careers. The principle applied to all of them. We stop paying attention. Another pause. We assume something is finished. A longer pause. We stop looking. The crowd remained silent, not because they were stunned, because they were listening. There are people standing here today who were told their skills no longer mattered. He gestured gently toward former workers. There are communities that were told manufacturing had no future. He looked toward the students. There are young people being told success only exists in a handful of professions. Daniel shook his head. "I don't believe any of that." The words carried no anger, only conviction, the kind built slowly over decades. The speech lasted only a few more minutes. When it ended, applause rose naturally, warm, respectful, human, exactly the way Daniel preferred. Later that afternoon, after most guests had left, he remained behind. The construction crews were already preparing equipment. Work would begin the next morning. Real work, the kind that turned plans into reality. As the sun lowered behind distant warehouses, Daniel walked one final time across the property. The training center would open next year. Thousands of students would eventually pass through its classrooms and workshops. Most would never know much about him. That was fine. The center wasn't supposed to preserve his legacy. It was supposed to create someone else's. Near the exit, Daniel stopped and looked back. The old plant, the future construction site, the fading sunlight. For a brief moment, past and future seemed to occupy the same space. Then his phone vibrated. A message from Emma. "Dinner at 7, don't be late." Daniel laughed. Some things never changed. He typed a response. "Already on my way." Then he slipped the phone into his pocket and headed toward his truck. Behind him stood the remains of where his journey began. Ahead of him waited the people who had given that journey meaning. And for the first time in a very long while, Daniel felt no urge to look backward. The empire would continue. The buildings would grow. The numbers would rise and fall. But the lesson that started everything remained beautifully simple. Sometimes, the future belongs to the people willing to see value where others see the end.